constructive processes inside the brains of the observer. And then we have Alois, you have to forgive my clumsy pronunciation, Alois Riga, who came up with, I think, the idea of the beholder's share, which was then elaborated by Gombrich, said that art is incomplete without the perceptual and emotional involvement of the viewer. It's saying very much the same thing at around the same time. Now, the idea of perception as inference, while the idea of this, the experience of seeing something as dependent on stuff inside our own heads, was taken a lot further and formalized by Hermann von Helmholtz, also in the late 19th century, a German physician and physicist. And his idea was perception as unconscious inference. And it's a very simple idea at heart, and it's something like this. On this view, the brain is locked inside a bony skull and it has no direct access to things out there in the world, if there are any such things as things out there in the world. All the brain gets are ambiguous and noisy sensory signals which are only indirectly related to their hidden causes, hidden behind this sensory veil. And so, in order to figure out what's out there, let's just assume for now that's the purpose of perception. It's not true, but never mind. To figure out what's out there, that is necessarily the process of inference about those causes, based on some prior knowledge, pre-wired in or through experience that the brain brings to bear, to resolve the ambiguity and the noise in the sensory signals that come in. So what we see is the brain's best guess of what's out there. Now immediately there's quite a nice resonance, I think, with some ideas of some examples from art that we can think of in this Monet. There's a certain ambiguity to this image, and there's a process of sort of inference about what might be the causes of that image. Rather than depicting the outcome, what's present in the image are the raw materials from which that perception is constructed. And that's where I guess I see this parallel with this concept of the beholder's share, which, while it was introduced by Riegel, was really elaborated by Gombrich later on. And the basic idea is there is no innocent eye. One cannot perceive what one cannot classify. So perception is bound up with prior knowledge, expectations that the brain has about the causes of sensory input. So what I'm going to talk about is this parallel. Now this is not really neuroaesthetics. And I think that's important to say, because any time you show a picture of a painting in a talk by a neuroscientist, you're likely to get a talk about neuroaesthetics. And as typically understood, and as you have experts here who know a lot more about this than I do, neuroaesthetics is the study of the brain basis of the creation and the contemplation of art, of aesthetic responses, aesthetic experiences generally. And here are two seminal figures in this field, active to various extents still today, Semir Zeki and D.S. Ramachandran. And here's two examples, just as contrast from what I'm going to be talking about, two sort of classic examples from the early days. And I don't think they don't necessarily represent the cutting edge of neuroaesthetics right now at all. So this is Ramachandran's peak shift theory of aesthetics, which is why do people like to see a statue like this? Well, it's because it certainly is emphasizing certain properties of how our normal perception of bodily shape and form. And this is, he appeals to this thing called the peak shift principle, whereby a response to a particular stimulus that's rewarded is enhanced if you accentuate that property. And sort of get a bigger response. In this case, it's just a wavelength of light that has a peak in it. Suddenly, when you shift it, and you get an enhanced property. The key thing for this is that while one wavelength is reinforced, there'll be another wavelength which is not reinforced, which is punished. So you're being pushed away from that. And so already that begins to undermine this argument a bit, because we have to have another. We have to have part of our perceptual system that's tuned to see whereas something quite close to this shape would be giving a negative valence, which I don't think is right. Fails in various other ways. But that's one example of trying to explain an aesthetic response by appealing to some quite simplistic or simple perceptual mechanism. Another thing, you typically see stuff like this, people exposed to, I can't remember what they're exposed to now in this stimuli, but they're rating something as beautiful, indifferent, or ugly at any rate. and you see some activity in part of the brain that correlates with that rating. And so this is like, okay, there's something happening in the brain, and we can maybe therefore understand something about people's judgments on this sort of scale. And maybe you can, but to me that's not a particularly interesting thing to do, at least at that level. There are many problems with this kind of approach. There are simplistic mechanisms. The peak shift theory doesn't really work when you try to apply it to the context in which Brahman tries to apply it to. There's a poverty of explanation. If you try and this is obviously can be a criticism of a lot of imaging work in neuroscience generally. You don't really learn very much by saying it's the medial orbitofrontal cortex that lights up more when you perceive something as ugly rather than indifferent. And that's constraint on a possible explanation, but it's not really an explanation. There's a poverty of explanatory target as well. Just if all you're interested in is whether people rate something as beautiful, ugly, or indifferent, or on a scale of how beautiful is that, well, you're missing the point of what beauty means, what the space of possible aesthetic responses could be. And finally, there's a kind of confusion between the image and what is depicted. A constraint on a lot of this work is you show somebody an image of something in a brain scanner, and it underestimates the context in which one might experience art generally. Plus, a lot of these theories don't really explain the difference between seeing an artistic object and seeing the thing itself. So exactly, I mean, this example doesn't really tell you anything about why this is an object of art. It's just telling you about your responses to bodily shapes in general. Should apply to real figures too. So there are some criticisms. But the implicit assumption underlying all this is that art and responses to it are something that requires science to come in and explain. I mean, this imperialist and colonial attitude, which I, as a neuroscientist, really don't like at all. Yeah. Having said all this, there is, of course, some value and some utility in trying to understand the brain basis of aesthetic response. I think treated within the larger context, that's fine. I just want to set out from the start that that's not what I'm going to do today. Instead of that, instead of a neuroscience of art or of aesthetics, how about art and neuroscience as complementary attempts to understand the nature of human experience, to understand the nature of our, in let's say the more restricted way, our visual conscious lives. I think that's much more productive. And of course, this is a point of view that's not new, it's been advanced over history too. Helmholtz himself said that we must look upon artists as persons whose observation of sensuous impressions is particularly vivid and accurate, and whose memory for these images is particularly true, so they're able, in a sense, to know more about how their subjective visual impressions are constructed than if we were not artists. Alvin Noe has been a pretty strident critic of neuroaesthetics over the years. Says here, and I agree with him, works of art do not merely cause experience, they also figure into the artist's ongoing effort, like that of science, to understand ourselves. They're trying to do the same thing from different ways. Now this is, if you like, a federal rather than a colonial relationship between art and brain science. They're both trying to do the same thing. And there have been some examples of this kind of approach before. This paper in Nature, more than 10 years ago by Kavanagh, he gives an example, and I think this is mentioned in Anil's paper in Trace, that the particular, I don't know if it's working on this projector, but the particular sort of shimmering nature of this painting can be partially accounted for by processing, the separate processing of colour and form in the visual system. So the sharp edges that we have differences in colour, but the differences in sharp edges are not easily resolved by the image. So we have this shimmering effect. And I think that's kind of nice. But that kind of explanation, most explanations of that sort, tend to rely on a rather bottom-up conception of how perception in the brain is instantiated. That's the sort of like the straw man, the classical view of visual perception. That stuff comes in to the retina and it goes its way up this extremely complicated visual hierarchy, and you have local processing of motion, of colour, of all sorts of things, places in different places. And the typical narrative of this kind of story is how we understand the particular experience of seeing a thing, a painting or a visual scene, in virtue of this kind of specialized, functional specialization. But I think this parallel between the Helmholtz idea of perception of inference, and Gombrich suggests that we should look not in terms of this bottom-up and specialization within the visual system, but rather in terms of this top-down inferential view of perception. And Hyman, in a also quite pointed critique of neuroaesthetics, he mentions Helmholtz's view, but he also says, and this was a few years ago now, that most visual scientists have abandoned Helmholtz's theory of vision and talks about this specialization and so on. And it's, in a way, it's really the case that this is not true anymore. It was really true then. That's the motivation for this talk, to take this Helmholtzian view forward. So that's the first bit. Now I want to give you a little bit more concrete examples of what I mean by perception as inference and how it works in the brain. And how it works specifically with respect to properties of our conscious phenomenological experience of vision, not just how we can discriminate A from B. So after being quite neglected within cognitive science and brain science, this Helmholtzian view, this Bayesian brain view, has gained quite a bandwagon status now, and in various forms is a very general theory of brain function, perhaps too general. And there's a couple of examples. They're both excellent papers, but they give some sense of the generality with which these ideas are applied. So Andy Clark's paper, Whatever Next, Predictive Brain, the Future of Cognitive Science, long article. And Carl Friston, who's known for his ideas, the free energy principle. I don't know, how many people have come across the free energy principle? One or two. So this is really a huge generalization of Helmholtz's ideas to explain life, the universe, and everything, accompanied by some quite impenetrable mathematics. But extremely important stuff as well, and we'll see some of his ideas come back later. Just to remind you, this is the basic idea. Perception is a process of inference on this theory. And here's some examples just to show what I mean by that in practice. Now, you'll probably have seen a couple of these before. How many people have seen the Abelson checkerboard? I'm sure many of you, but not everybody. So if you look at this thing here, I don't know quite what it is, but you will see the two shadows, the two on this checkerboard, the two patches marked A and B should look different shades of grey. I hope they will look to you to be different shades of grey, right? Now, they are, of course, in fact, exactly the same shade of grey, and that's why I put it up there, that's why it's an illusion. If you don't believe me, I'll put them up here as well and join these two, and you can see they're exactly the same shade of grey. There's no transition anywhere in this space, and if it's still a little bit unconvincing, we'll just move that across there, and you can see again, exactly the same shade of grey. Now, of course, this is fine, right? You know, this is the visual system is not supposed to be a light meter. It's not supposed to tell you the luminance of something out there in the world. It's supposed to tell you something useful about all that. And what's going on? Well, the brain encodes certain expectations about how cast shadows change the luminance of surfaces. And so when something is under this shadow here, we perceive it as lighter than it really is. It's absolutely fine. This also illustrates that even when you know something to be the case, it doesn't change how you perceive it. So that's an example of cognitive impenetrability. What we know to be the case doesn't change our subjective impression of this situation here. Here's another example. And this example is not cognitively impenetrable. Now, what is this a picture of?
Guitar.
Guitar, yeah? I think it looks like a picture of guitar. It is, but if I give you some context now, that's your best guess given that sensory data. But if I give you some context, you will see that it is, in fact, the shadow cast by a cat sitting on the edge of the toilet. And now that you know that, you can see that even when I take it away. Admittedly, it's kind of turned back into a guitar. This illustrates that these effects of our prior belief about the causes of sensation can change what we see very quickly. It doesn't have to be something that's so deeply embedded into the visual system. It can be quite transient. And it works also in the auditory domain. I'm going to illustrate with it. This is called sine wave speech. So if I just play you one sound, I'll explain what this means in a second.
Yeah, a strange sound, like
Anybody understand that? Try it again.
Jazz and swing bands like fast music.
Just whistling nonsense, isn't it? But now if I play you this,
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
and now I play again the original one,
Jazz and swing bands like fast music.
now you can understand it, right? So these are just the spectrograms of the two different sound files. So this was the natural sound with all these sharp transients and formants that characterize natural speech. And this is called sine wave speech, and that was the whistling one, where those sharp transients are removed. So this is very much an auditory analog of what I just showed you. Your expectation is now richer, so you experience the same sensory input in a very different way than you did before. And now this is very difficult to unhear, and now I can't go back to this sort of pre-lapsarian time where I only heard this as whistle. It goes on. The final example, which again shows how some expectations are so deeply embedded, is of course this rotating face example. This is 3D image of a mask, and as it rotates it seems to do something very weird, which is in the middle it starts rotating in both directions at once. Now this seems to be because the brain encodes a very strong perceptual prior that faces are things that point outwards. You don't ever see a face pointing inwards unless you're looking at the back of a mask. And that is such a strong prior that the brain is prepared to override sensory evidence to the contrary and give you this very strange perception, which is that the same object can rotate in two different directions at once, which is also unlikely. And it strikes me as very interesting that that's considered less likely or more likely than the alternative hypothesis that a face can be inside out. This actually works with, if you try this with a real mask, it's brilliant, it works just as well. And in fact, it has the really peculiar thing that it seems to follow you around as you move around the room once you perceive it inside out as pointing out, which is quite creepy. So the formalism for all this stuff is based here. And this is how to conceive of all these different effects in one way or another. And the idea, very simply, it's a very old mathematical idea that you have some, let's say, some value of a sensory input, of something in the world, something that's giving rise to some sensory input. And that has this particular value here. But you also have a prior belief about what that value might be, and this is the yellow curve. That's the sense data. And what you then perceive is simply the optimum or combination, the multiplication of these two things together, which gives you the Bayesian posterior, which is your perception. So the idea is that when we're doing perception, the brain is always in the business of updating its priors according to sense data to generate some posterior, and that shapes what you actually consciously perceive. That's Bayes' theorem in light, which is on the poster. Now this has an interesting consequence for how we think about this functional anatomy of the brain, the perceptual brain. So the classical way to think of it, Straw Man way again, is as this bottom-up system where low levels of, in this case, the visual cortex, deal with simple visual features like luminance, edges, patches like this, and some orientations. And higher levels deal, this is the primate monkey visual system, deal with complex configurations of features that define objects like faces and individuals and other objects. It's all a bottom-up processes of elaboration and top-down signals in this kind of framework are, if you like, just shaping, modulating, but the heavy lifting, the perceptual heavy lifting is done in this bottom-up direction. Now the Helmholtzian view swaps this around, and I think this is this really important conceptual shift where we now think of it's the top-down or inside-out connections that are doing the perceptual heavy lifting, that are carrying the content of our perception. And the bottom-up signals, the stuff that we tend to think of as sensory input, those just report the prediction errors, the differences between what the brain expects and what it gets at every level of perceptual processing. So what we see is what the brain is throwing out there into the world. And of course we've known for a very long time there's a great density, preponderance of these inside-out or top-down connections. Many more going back out to the sensory surfaces and in fact come the other way. So here's a schematic of how this process of predictive coding might operate in sort of three different layers of cortex here. And all I want to draw your attention to here is that you have, from the top down, you have these blue arrows which represent predictions about what's coming in from the level below, and the red arrows represent the prediction errors, which are resolved with the predictions at these different, within each cortical level. And there's now some interesting ideas about how the microcircuitry, the anatomy within each cortical level could implement something like updating the prediction given the prediction error coming in at that level. And makes predictions, for instance, about the laminar or the layer specificity here. So the idea is that the predictions originate in deep layers of cortex and go to superficial surface levels, and the other way around for the prediction error. So you can get some pretty sharp predictions about what one might see in brain dynamics. So that's the general scheme. This is about how you weight. If you're paying attention to something, you might take the prediction errors more seriously. That's supposed to be equivalent to attention in this framework. Paying attention is giving more weighting to prediction errors for a given focus of attention. Now this brings us back to an example from Impressionism. This I put in the talk yesterday because I was lucky enough to have time to go to the art gallery here and have a look at this. And in this example of Impressionist art, and I think this stands for many, there's no attempt to provide the pictorial detail, but rather the conditions, to create the conditions that enable the viewer to change the percept, to complete the picture based on prior experience of them as a person, but also in general in the visual system. So pretty rough artistic things going on here, palette scrapings, if you like, are sufficient to provide the powerful impression of dense woodland and its reflections. And so in one sense, this is what the Impressionists, I guess, were trying to do, to portray an ideal of objectivity, to remove the painter, to remove the artist from the act of painting, and to recover this idea of the innocent eye, to get past all those layers of representation. But in practice, this requires, by doing this, is sort of working back through all those layers of prediction of inference, and it requires a deep understanding of the visual system of exactly the kind that Helmholtz was advancing, of all those processes of best guessing that the brain does to create a percept from this ambiguous information. So really what I think is going on here is there's a reverse engineering of the visual system, and these examples of Impressionist art can be thought of as experiments to better understand the inferential processes that the visual brain engages in when it receives sensory input, generally. And it does not just depict the output, the outcome of that process, as sort of representationalist traditions do. So this is captured in a nice quote from Gombrich himself here. The artist gives the beholder more to do, he draws him into the magic circle of creation and allows him to experience something of the thrill of making, which has once been the privilege of the artist. So you're collaborating in the process of generating that conceptual experience because you're just giving the raw material. I think it's a very nice idea. So there's, if you like, a descriptive parallel between these two things. Now, for cognitive neuroscience, this raises a very important question, which is how, what's the evidence, and how exactly do perceptual expectations shape conscious perception? And these are kind of just, all I've shown you are illusions and some ideas before. So I want to give you a taste of the kind of evidence that there is now that something like this is going on. And this evidence comes in many different levels and forms, but I think is making quite a compelling case for this inferential view of perception. This is some very basic neuroanatomical data from a lab in Germany, and what they do is they have, this is from a monkey, and it's an implanted grid of electrodes on the cortical surface over a whole hemisphere. And what they show is that doing visual perception, there are top-down and bottom-up signals flowing at the same time across the whole visual cortex, and they flow in different frequency bands, in exactly the frequency bands that you would predict, given the mapping of predictive coding onto the cortex. So for those of you who know about the different brain oscillations, you have top-down, the predictions are carried, if you like, in these slower rhythms, the alpha rhythm, and the prediction errors in the gamma rhythm. This doesn't tell you that these are predictions and prediction errors. just tells you there are information flow in the cortex that's segregated by frequency. Some of the earliest evidence, now pretty old, showing that you can explain the receptive field properties of neurons very early on in visual cortex, and even as far as the retina in terms of predictive coding. So neurons a little bit further above in the visual hierarchy of predicting what is coming in from below and just responding to the differences, and then you can account for the properties of so-called complex cells in the visual system that have properties. They might respond, for instance, to edges, but only edges of a particular length, lines of a particular length. Fast forward to just a couple of years ago, this is, I think, some beautiful work by Lars Muckley in Glasgow. And what he did was he had people in the brain scanner look at an image, a complete image. Here's an old, I don't know why, this is an old car going down the street. And then look at the same image, but the actual sensory input is missing from a quarter of the image. And then you use these kind of brain reading algorithms to try to decode from the brain data what the person was looking at. And it turns out you can do this from part of the visual cortex that's not getting any visual input at all. And you can do it best also from the superficial layers of the visual cortex. Or sorry, the superficial layers here. So this means that these predictions can only work on the basis of top-down connections coming back towards visual cortex and nothing coming in at all. And you do better when you look at these superficial layers, which we would expect predictions to be manifest in. So that's very nice, but that is just to do with perception generally. It's not to do with conscious perception. It could be unconscious perception, it could be anything. So the next question is, what part of this process tells us anything about what we consciously see versus what we don't? And there's a couple of, again, very old papers, which I think are quite relevant to this, where they use transcranial magnetic stimulation. Now, this is a method where you basically apply a very powerful electromagnetic pulse, and you can interrupt the activity of a specific region of the brain. And what they did here was they applied this to V5, which deals with visual motion, specifically to interrupt the top-down signals that were going back to early visual cortex. And when they did that, leaving the feed-forward flow intact, they knocked out visual awareness of motion. So being aware of motion required these top-down connections, but not the bottom-up connections. In my lab, we've been doing some sort of seemingly quite trivial experiments, just asking the question, do we consciously see what we expect to see, or what violates our expectations? You might think that it's more important to see that which is surprising to us, which violates what we expect. But over a series of experiments, we find quite a lot of evidence that you see more easily, consciously, that which is in line with your expectations. You can generalize that to political beliefs, how far you want to go. But in this particular experiment, we just show in one eye either a face or a house, starting with zero contrast, and in the other eye this changing pattern of coloured blobs. And the point is, when you see a stimulus like this, you'll start by seeing just that, but at a certain point, the image will break through. And if you're cued to expect a face, you will see it more quickly, more accurately, and kind of things, than if you're cued to expect something else. So that's evidence that we see what we expect to see. And I think I'm going to skip over this experiment, it's a bit long to describe. But just to tell you what we found from this was that you can ask also with another psychophysical paradigm involving detection of very boring patches like this. You can ask, do perceptual expectations impose their influence on what we see at any particular times with respect to ongoing activity in the brain? And indeed we find there's this alpha rhythm, this 10 Hertz rhythm, that's very prominent over the visual cortex. And we find that an expectation, for instance, that you're going to see something or not going to see something, and that has a stronger effect at particular phases of this alpha rhythm than at other phases. So this is kind of interesting. It's as if there's this periodicity in the brain to paying attention to the prediction and then to the prediction error. So as if there's this alpha rhythm like every 100 milliseconds, there's an exchange of prediction and prediction error. Now all this stuff is using very boring stimuli, very far removed from the complexity of real-world experience. And so the next couple of examples bring us slightly closer to understanding how expectations shape our everyday conscious experience. Now, there's some, you've seen these all over the internet, I'm sure. We have such a strong predisposition to see faces and things. We'll see them in almost any random configuration of eyes, nose, and mouth. This is the famous face on Mars, and this is a kind of grumpy-looking bathroom sink. Now that idea was generalised very nicely by a group in Glasgow, Philip Shins. And what they did was they showed people just random black and white visual stimuli, visual noise, complete visual noise. But they told them in half of them there's a face and in half of them there's not a face. And so you now sort them into those where they say there's a face and those where they say there's no face. And if you average them all together, you get something that's a bit like a face. And so this is a way of revealing, if you like, the template, the perceptual prior for that individual of what a face is. They're seeing a face a little bit in this noise. And it's different for every person as well. You get a slightly different template now for every person. So this just shows this tendency to pattern recognition, that we impose pattern on what can be, in this case, completely unpatterned sensory input. And we've been doing something a little bit similar to this in the lab in Sussex, taking advantage of recent developments in machine learning that do extremely good image classification. And these are these so-called deep neural networks, deep convolutional neural networks, that can be used to classify photos, any kind of natural image, into things like, the really important questions like what breed of dog is in that image. And here's a typical example of one of these networks, lots of layers, and they're designed to do well. They're not designed to tell us about the cognitive neuroscience of the visual system. They're designed to do well, and they do very well. But the problem is nobody quite understands what's going on within these networks that do very well. So the clever people at Google decided to say, okay, to figure out what the layers within these networks are doing in order to classify the dog within this image, let's run it backwards. Let's fix the activity at a particular level and then change the image until the image matches what the network expects to be there. And then you get all kinds of amazing things, and I'm sure you've probably seen some of these as well, where you have these really rather psychedelic images of bowls of pasta turning into dog heads. But I think this is quite fascinating because it's reverse engineering the inferential processes happening within these networks to sort of show what parts of how the different, if you like, levels of granularity of our phenomenal experience are dependent on different levels of inference within the network. This is picking up on a high level where it's to do with objects, but you could do this at different levels as well and look at more geometric features that shape our conceptual experience. We have at Sussex University. Anybody been to Sussex University? So this is like a kind of, it's a trip in both senses of the word to Sussex University here, because what we've done is taken that deep dream algorithm and applied it to a panoramic video taken in the sort of the central square area of Sussex University. And you can strap on a VR headset and you can look around and experience a slightly unusual version of what it's like to be at Sussex. It's very immersive. You do this with the actual virtual reality headset. Now it looks like fun. Of course, it is a bit of fun, but the serious purpose here again is to try to use these methods from computational neuroscience and machine learning to engineer very precisely particular modifications of phenomenology, and take an outside of the laboratory context as well. So you're not just looking at an image on a screen 60 centimeters away, but you become very, it's a full peripherally rich experience. Now I'm really running out of time much quicker than I thought. I am going to skip peripheral perception and move to the next bit. So the first take home and is this idea that the perceptual content is a Bayesian fantasy constrained by reality. Now the second couple of parts are much shorter to hear. And this is when we go on to emotion and expression. So here's a couple of quotes again. William James, we had in the beginning, a disembodied emotion is a non-entity. The idea that emotion really is the perception of changes in the physiological state of the body. Without perception of that body, without a body, you don't have emotional states. Here's an example. Art is incomplete without the perception and emotional involvement of the viewer. Now, something I've been interested in for years is generalizing this idea of perception's inference to emotion. And this is now the idea that our emotional experience operates on exactly the same principle, but instead of an inference about the causes of, let's say, visual signals, emotional experience becomes an inference about the causes of interoceptive signals. These are signals that come from within the body that report on its internal physiological state, to the extent that that's relevant for survival. You can also have proprioceptive predictions about body position and angle, and indeed you can understand action generation in terms of the fulfillment of proprioceptive predictions. So interoception is largely overlooked in neuroscience, partly because it's hard to measure and it's hard to manipulate compared to vision. But it's massively important. It's what allows the body to regulate its state, to stay alive. And we're aware all the time of either basic interoceptive feelings like gastric distension and so on, but also emotional feelings and mood too, fundamentally shaped by interoception. So the same principles apply, but now we have interoceptive predictions and interoceptive prediction error, the content of which jointly contributes to our experiences of emotion and embodiment. This is, if you like, this is just bringing into the Bayesian world the old theory of William James and Carl Langer that emotion is a perception of, emotion follows our perception of the body and is not this cause. So you might, so the classic example is you see a bear, you see the bear, therefore you feel fear, therefore you set in train all kinds of body responses to fight or flee. James always said the opposite, that you see the bear, that sets in train all kinds of physiological responses to fight or flee, and it's the perception of those physiological changes that is the emotion of fear. And this is a generalization of that idea, and it's kind of nicely illustrated here. This is not any imaging data, this is just a heat maps of where people feel particular emotions to be in their bodies. And there's a lot of difference, where you feel anger in the head, where you feel contempt also in the head, and some, shame mainly in the chest. Now these interoceptive experiences of signals coming from inside the body shape not only emotions but also what we experience as being our bodies. And this is shown in a version of one of these classic experiments. This is the rubber hand illusion, which is a well-known, very well-known kind of cross between an experiment and a party trick. Everybody know what the rubber hand illusion is? I'll show you the video anyway because it's fun. This just shows that whereas it might seem quite plausible that we expect our visual experience to change all the time because we're moving around, looking at different things all the time. But we don't really expect our experience of that part of the world that is our body to change or to be. We take it for granted, it seems to be always there. But it's surprisingly flexible, and you can change it by simply giving coordinated multi-sensory cues. So here's somebody looking at a rubber hand. Their real hand is hidden, and they see the rubber hand being touched, being stroked by a paintbrush, and they feel touched because their real hand is also being stroked. So there's a congruence between tactile and visual input. So they do this, and so beginning to experience this hand with this hand, and that's of course that's one way to test it, but there are more sophisticated, but they're less interesting ways. That's going on. Now we did a version of this experiment using virtual reality here, but instead of the paintbrush, so somebody's looking at their virtual hand, instead of the paintbrush, we recorded their heartbeat, and the virtual hand now is flashing in time or out of time with their heartbeat. So now there's a sort of multi-sensory synchrony between what their heart is doing and what they see on the hand. And of course you don't really see your heartbeat on your hand unless you're exercising, but the idea of the brain is perceiving that anyway. So that's the manipulation, and the prediction is when the virtual hand is beating in time with your heartbeat, you'll experience it as more like your hand. And indeed that's what happens. Here's just a video of the, it's not as strong an effect as the tactile one, but it's still there. You can imagine this is fused into a 3D image when you're wearing the headset. It's a bit of a weird jerky hand, but you can see it gently flashing through red and back. And so this shows that the brain is putting together signals from inside the body and outside the body in deciding what in the world is part of its body. Using this VR setup, you can ask all different questions as well. You can map hand movements onto the body. You can have your virtual hand change skin color to see if this affects your social judgments or your racist biases on things like the implicit association test. And the one I think is the most subjectively powerful and interesting is when your virtual hand changes signs very dramatically. Now there's a neurological condition called Alice in Wonderland syndrome where people report exactly this kind of experience. Their body limbs are telescoping up and down in size. And we can sort of model this and also show, for instance, that when your hand is very, very small, then you perceive reachable objects as being bigger than they are. So we experience peripersonal objects, the size of them with respect to our hand, but not objects that are out of reach. They're unaffected by them. So that all brings us back to expressionist art, which then is trying to, in a way, exaggerate salient features to bring to the attention of observers the unconscious markers of emotional systems, I think, as Anil puts it. So they're trying. So this is the idea that now instead of just engaging visual inferential processes, this kind of art is also engaging and taking advantage of our interoceptive and proprioceptive predictions about bodily form and about emotion. So that, I think I just read that a little bit. By exaggerating salient features, yes, I just read that already. So I think this sort of has a nice sort of descriptive resonance there. But the idea is that visual experiences are shaped not only by visual signals but also by interoceptive predictions about the causes of visual signals. And in turn, emotional responses are shaped by visual predictions that are themselves informed by interoceptive inference. So there's this sort of completely circular causality between interoceptive emotional predictions and visual predictions, not that one follows the other. And so I think, it's instead of thinking of sort of expressionism as the opposite of impressionism, whereas impressionism sort of wants to get rid of the artist and recover the innocent eye, I tend to think of it as a generalization where instead of just reverse engineering a vision, we now reverse engineer the interoceptive and emotional responses that particular sensory input generates as well. So second one, emotion itself, the brain's best guess of those signals most likely to be me. And I'll finish in 5 minutes just with, oh no, look at that. Exactly on time, I've run out of time, but I'm going to continue for another 5 minutes. And just talk about one last aspect of predictive perception, which is active influence. And this is relevant for this idea of perceptual phenomenology, which is objective, that we see an object as, in the real world, as a real object, as having a back and sides, and filling a particular volume, and not just as an image, as this is an image of a tomato. A real apple, you would perceive it as a real apple, not as an image of an apple. Of course, this is played with in the Greece picture here. The difference between what's depicted and the depiction itself. And Alvin talks a lot about this property of phenomenology, perceptual presence. How can it be true, as I think it is, that we are perceptually aware when we look at a tomato? I think I missed out a bit of that quote. That we are, of parts of the tomato which, strictly speaking, we do not perceive. I missed that bit. the idea that we somehow perceive the back of an object, even though the back of an object is not providing any sensory input to us. That's part of what it is to perceive an object as an object. The object's perception or experience is real. So this is why I think it's, this is the idea that I think is pretty clear in some of this Cubist artwork, where objects are broken up and reassembled and depicted from multiple points of view at the same time, so that you get a powerful impression of objects. But it also emphasizes the flatness of the representation that's giving you that impression of objects. So how to explain, in terms of brain mechanisms, this property of objective presence? Well, Anil has his own theory, which is this kind of sensory motor theory, which is that vision is something that we do. And so perceptual presence results from an implicit knowledge of the way in which our sensory, or in which way our actions, or what he calls perspectival takes, would alter subsequent visual input. So the brain somehow knows that if I rotated the object and moved my head around it, it would change in a particular way. And the predictability of that change is what endows the experience with that property of presence. The experience of an apple is given by an implicit knowledge of the ways in which moving our eyes and bodies would reveal sensory information about the apple. Now, no, it doesn't give any kind of mechanism for how that might actually happen, but predictive coding can do that for you a little bit. You've seen this before, this is the standard picture of prediction errors and predictions. But what's important here, and this is from a slide from Carl Frisson, is that we can minimize prediction error either by changing our predictions or by making actions to change the data. If I'm predicting something to be the case, well, I can just make it the case. If I'm expecting to see a face, I can look and see a face instead of updating my predictions that I'm in fact looking at a chair. And that's called active inference then, that we have this balance between action and perception. But of course, in order to minimize prediction error through acting, the brain needs to know what the consequences of making an action would be. You can't just make random action. It needs to know what would be likely to minimize that prediction error. So it has to encode, if you like, conditional, counterfactual predictions about what sensory input would I get were I to make this kind of action. And that's a nice way, I think, to think about what might actually give rise to this phenomenon of presence, the degree to which, when presented with a set of sensory input, my brain is able to make a rich set of conditional predictions about how that input would change when I make a variety of actions. I've written about this in a very long and boring paper a couple of years ago. But I want to just show you how we attempt to test that idea in the lab, and this is ongoing work, where we use augmented reality again here. And the idea is very simple, that we have virtual objects that are represented in 3D in an immersive scene, but they either, in this case, this object behaves as you would expect a real object to behave when you rotate it. But this object is a little like the moon. It always shows you the same face no matter what you do. So you can't learn a rich set of counterfactual predictions about it. And this one, it does something, but it does weird stuff when you move it around. So now it's always invalidating your predictions. So the hypothesis, and this is something we're still working on, is that experience in those different situations will lead you to not only learn different things about the object, but experience their objectness to different degrees. Right. So I am about to wrap up now, and in summary, to go back to where I started, I think what we're trying to do in this talk is show that art and brain science can be both seen to ask similar questions about the nature of human, in this case, visual experience. What are its causes? What shapes our overall subjective response to sensory input? And the particular emphasis is on perceptions as a top-down generative process, that what we see as a controlled hallucination, it's a fantasy that coincides to some extent with reality. It's not just this bottom-up process of elaboration, and it's understanding the inferential contribution to perception that I think sheds some new light on this parallel between art and brain science. And that's in impressionism, just the generative nature of perception, giving the raw material expressions and the involvement of emotional predictions and then the experience of objective and presence. And I didn't talk about this at all, but in abstract art, perhaps there's even more reliance on the beholder's share because there's nothing much to go on in the sensory input sort of by itself in the absence of any context. So this is the last slide, and maybe more discussion points than anything, but what can the visual arts offer neuroscience? And there's an enormous amount that a consideration of art can offer neuroscience. One thing is to prevent overreaching implications about how the brain supports experience from these overly simplified laboratory situations. You can't learn everything about what it is to be living in a rich visual world by studying the response to a boring Gabor patch 60 centimeters in front of you in a dark room. Most importantly, I think it provides novel phenomenological explanatory targets in neuroscience, especially from the point of view of understanding consciousness. What we want to explain is the structure of everyday conscious experience in all its richness, with peripheral vision, with multiple objects, with ambiguity. That's what we want to understand. Things like objective is a very, very important component of perceptual experience, and it's not really studied in neuroscience, but art's been thinking about it for a very long time. So it can guide neuroscientists to ask the right questions, I think. And so insights into this difference between depiction and that which is depicted. So in neuroscience, you can't learn everything by reducing everything to a situation where you show an image in the brain scan. You have to get out there into the real world as well and study experience in the wild. I think these are all, and art, of course, you experience in the gallery, but a lot of art's making the point that it's in a gallery situation and it's not the thing itself. What can neuroscience offer to visual arts? Well, that's pretty clear, and it's not a theory of art or of aesthetics. It's more a mechanistic insight into this beholder's share. What do we mean by saying there's the emotional involvement of the viewer? Well, we might mean something like what I've been talking about, and cognitive neuroscience can help delineate the mechanisms by which expectations shape and constitute our phenomenal experience. And maybe there will be some insight into the specific experience of particular. You could maybe take that impressionist thing and say something, just as something already been said about the separation of colour and form. Maybe we can say something about the degree to which perceptual inference is engaged to understand a bit about the subjective experience of that particular piece of art. And also, there's this, I gather there's this sort of concept of how our perception of art might change in different cultures and different societies, the so-called different points in history, the so-called period of eye. And one of the things in the Bayesian brain is, and we've done some stuff on this I didn't talk about, trying to understand the influence of social stereotypes on visual perception. Can our cultural context drill down to change how you see the world? And that can be accommodated very naturally as just another hierarchical level in this framework above the individual. And perhaps an understanding of some sort of aesthetic response as well. There are some theories within this beholder's share, within the predictive coding idea, that a feeling of aesthetic pleasure comes from the way in which prediction errors are minimized in the act of observation. I don't agree or disagree with that theory, but it's nice to see that a theory like that can be expressed. But that's just a perhaps. I think the other stuff is just important. So that's me done. I just wanted to thank, these are the people who are involved with the experiments that I showed you. These are not the same people, these are just other people in the lab. Some of them are the same, some of them aren't. But I couldn't find a picture that matched all those names. And generally thanking everybody. And thank you very much for your attention.
Chatterjee is going to begin the discussion by offering a few informal, formal remarks on the presentation. Professor Chatterjee is the Frank and Gladys Elliott Professor and Chair of Neurology at Pennsylvania Hospital. He is a member of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and the Center for Neuroscience and Society here at Penn, and he's the author of the book, The Aesthetic Brain.
All right. Thank you for that very rich talk. There are a lot of pieces to touch on, but I'll keep it short. I'll start with Anil's emphasis on the fact that he's not doing neurosthetics, and the extent to which he protests suggests that the term itself carries some trauma for him. And I wonder what that is. Certainly people like Simon and Noe have been very critical of neurosthetics, but in my view they're critical of the wrong thing. And by that I mean that many people sort of think of neurosthetics as this thing that is fixed in amber from 1999, which is the papers by Zeki and Ramachandran is regarded as what neurosthetics is, and pretty much everybody who does neurosthetics work right now discards those papers, right? So to me the critique is not, or I would reframe, take the, suggest that the reframing is that Professor Seth is not doing neurosthetics. He's just not doing the neurosthetics that Zeki and Ramachandran did circa 1999. And the point about this is that neurosthetics is simply a convergence of a long tradition in psychology of empirical aesthetics that goes back to Gustav Fechner and cognitive neuroscience. So anything that is happening in cognitive neuroscience or experimental psychology is fair game for neurosthetics. Like any field, it's an evolving field. Okay, so now let's get back to some of the specific things, which is a critical issue in neurosthetics over the last, I would say, 5+ years has been what are the influences of top-down effects on our aesthetic experiences, right? And that's another way of saying something very similar to the way in which our expectations have an impact on how we appreciate art. And there are, in terms of just behavioral findings, among the most robust findings are that people who are educated in art and have some experience in art have a very different experience of looking at art. You can track this by their eye movement, and most robustly, perhaps the single most robust finding in empirical aesthetics is people with education in the arts like abstract art, and people who are naive to abstract art can't stand it. Right? This is the most robust thing, and this has to be what kind of expectations and knowledge that people bring to bear on these kinds of phenomena. In terms of imaging, there have been a few experiments, and people are interested in these kinds of things. So I'll just give you one example, which is this was done in Copenhagen, where people were shown images, abstract images, and in one condition they were told that these images were hanging in a fancy gallery in Copenhagen, and in another they were told that these were random algorithms generated by a computer. Right? So what they're looking at is exactly the same thing, and so the perceptual input is identical, yet their behavioral responses to both are different. If they think it's in a gallery, they say that they like it more. And not only that, their neural responses are different, and different in the sense that, again, the same part that was shown in one of the slides, is medial overfrontal cortex, seems to be activated in a more robust fashion when people think they're hanging in a gallery, even though they're looking exactly the same thing. And so these are just examples. We had a study looking at beauty, not art per se in this case, but showing that in early visual cortex, that in parts of visual cortex that is tuned to processing faces in an adjacent area, that there is neural response to beautiful faces that varies parametrically, even when people aren't thinking about beauty. Now, one implication of that is this relatively, it's high level of vision, but it's still visual cortex, is not simply classifying visual objects, it's also evaluating them. And that has to be somehow coming from top-down information. But precisely what that is, we don't know. So, going back to the general point is, I would suggest that much of what Anil talked about would fit well into the mainstream of contemporary neurosthetics, which is that, look, there are different kinds of neurosthetics. One is, as he says, is neuroscience and aesthetics, which is what he's talking about, where you take a kind of, where you take information that you have from neuroscience and see how well they apply to certain kinds of aesthetic experiences. And the other is in neuroscience of aesthetics, which is not what he presented. But nonetheless, I would say there's no need to be embarrassed by the term. The second question is about, or not question, but as an experimentalist, we're always interested in what's the next experiment we could do that would be really seminal. And there's a bit of an irony in a model of predictions and prediction errors that mostly what I know is what's the prediction for a neuroscience experiment out of this, right? That's what I would really like to get out of it. So the behavioral experiments are clear, but the neuroscience experiments are not exactly clear in humans, right? How would you actually do an experiment in humans where you get neural data that is consistent with this kind of prediction model? And this is generally a question. The issue of equal partners, I think this is undoubtedly true of the idea that artists have spent a long time individually and as in the tradition of arts thinking about vision and without a doubt capture something very important about human experience. But this is true, I think, for any domain where people have spent a lot of time thinking about human experiences. So one might say that that musicians certainly, and there's a robust field of the cognitive neuroscience of music, but even chefs, right? We all eat. This is fundamental, but people care about what we eat and how we eat. And chefs have figured out a lot of ways in which different combinations work. Or people who make perfumes. These are other sensory systems that there's expertise in how we create the experience of people's taste and people's smell. And one would assume that they are also equal partners if you're interested in olfactory systems or you're interested in gustatory systems. And so the question is there anything different about artists than any other group of people that have expertise over a period of time in creating a kind of human experience that many of us experience? And maybe there isn't, but people tend to like to view art as somehow exceptional. And the question is art exceptional in any way other than a group of people that have thought very seriously about a kind of experience? And so would chefs also be equal partners to neuroscientists? Would people who make perfumes also be equal partners to neuroscientists? So that's a general question I'm interested in. And then finally, as a clinician, the deep dreaming bit was to me fascinating, and particularly some of the imagery you showed at Sussex. And my immediate thought was, with that kind of reverse engineering based on the model, are there insights to be gained for clinical populations, particularly people who have these kinds of perceptual distortions and hallucinations?
So, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I don't take up too much more time, but thank you for that very thoughtful response. I'm not at all embarrassed about neurosthetics, and I agree with very much of what you said. I think it's really a difference of emphasis rather than substance. So I think even moving on way past 1999, the examples you were giving, the focus is still on understanding the nature of the aesthetic experience. And that's fine, and that's a reasonable thing to do, but it's not the only thing that this parallel can bring. In a descriptive way, this parallel is about understanding, for instance, what's our peripheral experience like, whether it generates an aesthetic experience or not. I think these two things can be a little bit independently asked. And so my particular emphasis is to care first about that, and second about the aesthetic response that an artistic rendering of that component of our experience might elicit. So they're overlapping, but there's a difference in emphasis. And now, what the next thing? So yes, maybe I'm doing a bit of neuroscience. And I think that was also in your idea about the top-down influences about sort of education and how that plays into people's evaluations, especially things like abstract art. Well, again, it's their evaluations of the aesthetic experience of that artwork, not of what the phenomenology of the sort of visual phenomenology is. And I think that's again a separate question one might ask, and a different kind of top-down expectation as well. That's a very kind of enculturated expectation, rather than a deeply embedded sort of low-level inference that the visual system might undertake. Now, I think you have an extremely good point about what experiment to do. Of course, one of the advantages of empirical neuroaesthetics is you can put people into an experiment. You can see what happens in their brain when they see such and such. And that has advantages as well as limitations. Now, I'm a bit resistant to. I think there's an enormous value in thinking of art as motivating different kinds of experiments, and that then in themselves don't necessarily involve pieces of art. So understanding the nature of our peripheral phenomenology, yes, that's something that you might think to do anyway. It's something that might just come up. But I think looking at how art treats that part of the visual experience gives some interesting ideas about, well, we haven't thought about that enough, because there might be this kind of visual input might be very useful in shaping peripheral phenomenology. Having said that, I can imagine doing a kind of experimental neuroaesthetics, combining the kind of machine learning stuff that underlies deep dreaming. So, for instance, you could ask the question, all right, with a particular kind of art, when I put someone in the brain scanner, and now I'm not worried about whether they rate it as being beautiful or ugly or they're indifferent, but what I'm wondering is how their visual system responds to that artwork when analysed through what I would predict a neural network to respond to that piece of artwork in terms of which levels would respond to which levels of inference about the causes. So that might help map phenomenology onto mechanism in a richer way. So I think there would be that kind of experimental avenue to follow. And yes, I'm sure that the idea of working together rather than one being subordinate to the other is something that's very easy to agree with. I just think it's maybe not done, it doesn't come across in practice as often like that to the extent that it should. And there are collaborations called neat partner collaborations between chefs and neuroscientists as well. Seth and Blumenthal spend a lot of time working with neuroscientists in London, trying to develop wonderful new recipes, and so then they get studied in brain scanning situations as well. But I think, and I do tend to think there is a difference between people, maybe like chefs or manufacturers of perfume, who are interested in generating particular kinds of experience, than art, which is not only about generating a particular experience, it's about reflecting on the causes and the context in which that experience happens. And that, I think, is so this interesting, the difference between what is the image of the thing and the thing itself. I'm not quite sure that is so important when you're designing the next perfume. And yeah, those are my responses. Largely in agreement, but I do think there's a difference in emphasis.
One other thing, you think about the deep dreaming, if that would have...
Oh yes, of course, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so this is something that is going to be very hard to get ethics for, but we study patients with first episode psychosis. Now the last thing you'll get ethics for is giving them a virtual reality experience, which is kind of really disturbing and hallucinogenic. But I do think it sheds light, maybe in a comparative way. So in a sense, what we would like to do is use these VR situations to provide a phenomenological model of disturbed perception under different psychiatric and pharmacological manipulations, and then draw comparisons between the clinical populations and people under those situations. But yeah, it's kind of what's being termed computational psychiatry to do that. What are the mechanisms that underlie specific phenomenological disturbances, rather than just what's the difference when you compare one clinical population with actual controls. So yes, I think that's exciting.
Great. So maybe we'll shift now to questions from the audience, and If there are students that want to ask questions, I encourage you to raise your hands. I'll try to call on you first.